Washington has placed more than 8,000 US-based troops on a heightened state of alert, and NATO is sending more warships and fighter jets to member states in Eastern Europe. Now, tension in the region has been building, with around 100,000 Russian troops massed near Ukraine's borders. President Putin has publicly stated his belief that Russia and Ukraine are one people. He claims that one of his key concerns is the expansion of NATO, that's the military alliance of European states with the US and Canada. Many countries in Eastern Europe became members of NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union. Mr. Putin's demand that Ukraine never be allowed to join NATO has been rejected. From Kiev, our correspondent Gabriel Gatehouse sent this report.
This is a country in limbo, waiting for an invasion that looks more likely with every passing day, but may yet never come. To the east, 100,000 Russian troops are massed, but the Kremlin says talk of an invasion is hysteria. Facing them are Ukrainian soldiers who hear Western leaders sounding the alarm in ever starker tones. And stuck in between are the people of Kiev, who, frankly, don't know what to believe.
I think something might happen. I think the probability is very high, but God knows. I think even Putin doesn't know yet what kind of decision he's going to take. But the situation is horrible.
At the weekend, Britain warned that Russia was planning a coup to install a little-known former MP as puppet ruler, suggestions that have been widely dismissed, both in Moscow and here in Kiev. The UK began pulling staff out of its embassy today, saying an invasion could come at any time. The Americans are doing the same. A senior Ukrainian politician told the BBC today such actions are not helpful.
If people start panicking, that leaves our country in a very dangerous position, and it will make it easier for Russia to manipulate us.
The reality is, of course, that this country is already at war and has been since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and funded and provided weapons and sent in troops to support a separatist rebellion in the east. Around 14,000 Ukrainians have already died in that conflict. These are some of their faces. And so for people here, the question is not, will there be war, but will this war escalate? For months now, the Ukrainians have been preparing a territorial defense force. Volunteers like Marta Yuskiv, a doctor in her 50s, is among those who are training for a possible defense of Kiev.
Of course I'm worried, because I'm a peaceful woman. I don't want to have a war started, but in any case, in case it started, I should be ready to defend the country.
Meanwhile, a kind of normal life continues as the people of this country wait nervously to see what fate and larger geopolitical forces have in store. Gabriel Gatehouse, BBC News, Kiev.
Well, this evening, President Biden led a conference call with European leaders to discuss the crisis in Ukraine. And all day, Western leaders have been warning Russia of the consequences of invading that country. There were statements early this evening from the Pentagon in Washington and from NATO, but we start with the UK.
Invading Ukraine, from a Russian perspective, is going to be a painful, violent and bloody business. And I think it's very important that people in Russia understand that this could be a new Chechnya.
NATO is a defensive alliance which does not threaten Russia or any other country. But we will always do what is necessary to protect and defend all our allies. And I welcome that allies are stepping up.
The United States will act firmly in defense of its national interests in response to actions by Russia that harm us, our allies, our partners.
Well, in a moment, we'll be talking to our Moscow correspondent, Steve Rosenberg, for the latest there. First to Washington, our correspondent, Barbara Plett-Usher. Barbara, acting firmly, said the Pentagon spokesman. Does that mean in economic terms with sanctions, or does it mean in military terms, possibly?
Well, it means both, actually, Hugh. They have been saying all along that there would be severe sanctions if the Russians send troops over the border into Ukraine, financial sanctions, export controls on technology that's needed for key industries, that sort of thing, but also militarily. Now, the Americans are not going to be sending troops to Ukraine. They've made that very clear. Actually, Ukraine, of course, is not a NATO ally, so they don't have that obligation. But they are sending weapons and increasing numbers of weapons. What they have announced now is that they are prepared to send troops to Eastern Europe, to NATO allies in Eastern Europe, as part of a NATO reaction force if one is called up on the border with Russia. That they are on alert. They have not yet been deployed. And all of this is in the language of unity and resolve. There's been a real push in the last couple of days to again project unity between the United States and Europe and NATO, and that was at least part of the impetus for the call that President Biden held with European leaders here this afternoon. In fact, there's been quite a ramp up of the rhetoric of alarm over the past couple of days, although the security situation itself, while worrying, hasn't really changed that much. So there's been some criticism that the West is contributing to the escalation. But the State Department really rejected that quite strongly when we asked about it today. They said, no, this is all about deterrence and defense.
Barbara, many thanks for the thoughts there in Washington. Let's go to Moscow and talk to Steve Rosenberg. Steve, these statements, this attempted projection of unity, deployment of troops, we've already talked about that in the past few days. What's the reaction there in Russia then?
Well, I mean, the Russians have already criticised what they call Western hysteria over Ukraine, and they will surely apply the same label to any future Western troop deployment. I think the problem for NATO now is it sees a threat, so naturally it wants to boost security for its allies and its partners, and that means deploying more warships and more fighter jets and potentially thousands of troops to Eastern Europe. But the danger of that is that it plays into the Kremlin's narrative that the West threatens Russia's national security, and that sparks more muscle flexing by Moscow and more instability. Having said that, I think the Kremlin could see today that the one thing that muscle flexing and saber rattling is bad for is the financial markets, because what we saw today, Russian stocks falling sharply, the Russian ruble fell against the dollar, and the dollar against and the pound, and that adds to a sense here that many people are concerned about where all of this is leading.
Steve, many thanks again. Steve Rosenberg with the latest thoughts there in Moscow, and Barbara Pletascher in Washington.